Ever catch yourself putting on an act when you're out and about? Like slipping into a costume just to deal with everyday stuff.
Hmm.
Well, turns out that feeling, that's something a lot of autistic people experience all the time.
Yeah.
It's called masking. And today we're really going to dig into this whole idea of high masking.
Okay.
We've got this fascinating article from Cheap ABA, and you know what really struck me?
What's that?
It challenges this whole idea that masking is always a bad thing.
Yeah, it's true. Masking often gets kind of a bad rap, right?
Totally.
I mean, who wants to feel like they're always hiding who they really are?
Exactly. It just sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
But this article, it really got me thinking about how it's not always so black and white.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's not so much about it being good or bad as recognizing that it's a tool. It's like almost like a social Swiss Army knife,
Okay.
for autistic individuals. And this tool can be incredibly helpful, right? But if you're constantly using it for absolutely everything, it can wear you down just like any other tool if you're constantly using it.
That's such a good way to put it, like an analogy, right? So help me get this straight. When would masking actually be a good thing?
Okay, so let's say you have an autistic person and they find big social gatherings really overwhelming,
Okay.
which is a pretty common
Yeah.
experience. By using these masking techniques, they might be able to go to like a work lunch or a family get-together without feeling completely drained.
Right.
And, that could lead to better relationships with their colleagues or having, smoother interactions with their family. Everybody wins.
Right. So it's like it gives them a way to engage but not feel completely spent afterwards.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Just like with any tool, you can overdo it.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's say that same person feels pressure to constantly suppress their stimming behaviors, let's say at work,
Yeah.
because they're afraid of being judged.
Right, right.
That's when masking can become detrimental.
It's less about navigating and more about just suppressing who you are.
Exactly.
And that's not good for anyone long term.
And that's where the spectrum idea comes in, and how that impacts a person's well-being.
So if we're talking about masking being on a spectrum, and it's not always good or bad, what's going on for someone who's doing it a lot? Like high masking, what's the cost of that? And how do we even know it's happening if someone's really good at it? You were saying something about well-being and masking and how that all works.
Yeah, it's like imagine running a marathon, right?
Okay.
But your shoes are way too tight.
Ugh, I don't even want to think about it.
You might push through the pain for a while, but eventually it's going to catch up to you.
Yeah.
That's kind of what high masking is like.
Yeah.
The article talks about burnout being a big consequence.
Right.
And it makes sense because it takes so much energy to constantly be monitoring and adjusting your behavior, trying to fit in.
Especially when your brain isn't wired to fit in that way,
Right.
right? Like it's not just being tired, it's got to be emotionally draining too.
Oh, absolutely. It goes way beyond just being tired. Think about it, constantly questioning. Am I saying the right thing? Am I reacting the right way?
Yeah.
Would people even like the real me?
Right.
That can really mess with your sense of self. Makes it hard to figure out who you are, what you really want, especially for autistic people who might already be trying to navigate a world that doesn't always make sense to them.
It makes you realize, even for people who aren't autistic, we all feel that pressure to fit in sometimes, right? To be a certain way depending on who we're with. When does adapting become too much?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to really get this whole high masking thing. Just because someone looks fine on the outside.
Does that mean they're not struggling?
Exactly. High masking can actually make it harder for people to see when someone needs help
Hmm.
because they're so good at keeping it all together. It's like, you're trying to read a book, but half the pages are ripped out.
You're not getting the full story.
Exactly.
Wow, yeah, that makes you think about how important it is to talk about things, especially in a world where it's so easy to judge or make assumptions. So how do we move away from judging masking and toward actually supporting autistic people? So we're talking about moving away from judgment and towards support.
Right.
This article you shared, it really seems to be saying that choice is important.
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually create a world where autistic people feel like they can mask if they need to or unmask if they want to, depending on what feels right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it starts with understanding that, it's not about saying masking is bad. We all have to stop doing it.
Right.
It's more about, recognizing that this is a choice that people are making
Yeah.
and that we need to create spaces where they feel comfortable being themselves.
Yeah, and feeling safe, right. That's a big part of it.
Totally.
It's not about forcing anyone to unmask, but making it so they can if they want to.
Absolutely.
So how do we actually get there?
Well, the article mentions a few things, like open communication is huge, you know?
Yeah.
We need to be having these conversations about masking,
Right.
both the good and the bad, and doing it without judging people.
Right. Creating that space to talk about it openly.
Exactly. And then just like general awareness and education are super important too.
Right.
So people understand what masking is, why it happens, how it can affect people.
So it's okay to talk about it, whether it's hard or,
Right.
whatever people are going through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Of course not.
What works for one autistic person might not work for another, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, it's about tailoring the support, but what does that actually look like?
Well, it could be something as simple as, having quiet spaces in workplaces
Okay.
or in schools where people can just kind of decompress,
Yeah.
not feel like they have to mask.
Right. Have a break from it.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Or it could be about helping them communicate their needs better,
Okay.
to their boss or their teachers, whoever.
Yeah.
It's really just about recognizing that everyone's experience is valid
It is. Yeah.
and deserves to be met with understanding
Absolutely.
and support that's tailored to them.
There's this one line from the article that really stuck with me. It said, instead of asking, how much are you masking? Maybe we should be asking, what kind of support do you need?
Yeah.
And it just seems so simple, but it could really change things.
Totally. It shifts things away from this kind of judging thing
Yeah.
to actually caring.
Right. And trying to understand what people need.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive on masking.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for breaking all of that down for
Of
us.
course. It's glad to be here.
And to everyone listening, we really hope this gets you thinking about how you can make the world a more welcoming place for everyone, autistic or not.